how'd you do? I see you've met my faithful handyman. He's just a little brought down because when you knocked, he thought you were the candy man. Don't get strung up by the way I look. Don't judge a book by its cover. I'm not much of a man by the light of day, but by night I'm one hell of a lover. I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. Let me show you a rhyme and maybe play you a sign. You look like you're both pretty groovy. Or if you want something visual that's not too abysmal, we could take in an old Steve Reeves movie.
I'm glad we caught you at home. Could we use your phone? We're both in a bit of a hurry.
Right.
We'll just say where we are, then go back to the car. We don't want to be any worry.
Well, you got caught with a flat world. How about that? Well, babies, don't you panic. By the light of the night, it'll all seem alright. I'll get you a satanic mechanic. I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. Why don't you stay for the night?
Right.
Or maybe a bite.
Right.
I could show you my favorite obsession. I've been making a man with blonde hair and a tan, and he's good for relieving my tension. I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. Hey, I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
Oh, it's so good to see so many familiar names.
Yes, hello, welcome everyone. Let me just get my presentation shared here and we'll get us going. All right, my team, give me a thumbs up if we can see the presentation. All right, wonderful. So welcome everyone. I know you had a lot of wonderful choices of sessions to go to today, so we're all very appreciative to have you here with us. My name is Wendy Silva. I am in the English and Media Studies at Riverside City College, along with my colleague Robert Hires, and then my colleague Brian Keene, who's from the Art History Department, and my colleague Andrea Dillon, who's from Life Sciences. We also had a fifth member, Diana McDougall, who was unable to be with us here today, unfortunately. But our presentation today is going to be centered on queer visibility in the community college classroom. And so before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Brian, who's going to start us off with a land acknowledgement.
Good morning and buenos dias to everyone. We're thrilled to be here, and we wanted to acknowledge that the land, water, air, and natural resources around our homes and workplaces in what is now called by settlers Riverside in this corner of Turtle Island or North America are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tongva, Cahuilla, Payom-Cahuicham, and numerous other indigenous communities whose presence here stretches back in time immemorial and remains vibrant today. We offer our gratitude and commit to living in harmony with our environment and the people around us. We felt that it was important to begin with such an acknowledgement in a session about queer visibility, because too often our Indigenous neighbors, ancestors, elders, and communities, past, present, and emerging, are also invisible in a lot of the curriculum in our courses. And so we've worked to bring these materials into our classrooms and to highlight that Indigenous peoples are still here with us today. They've never gone away. Wendy, back to you.
Thanks, Brian. So I want to start off by telling you all a little bit about why we chose to do this particular presentation when we got the call for the proposals for the summit. And so, as you all know, queer visibility in general has been increasing over the last several decades, which includes in the college classroom. However, for the majority of our LGBTQ+ students, this visibility comes first, usually during upper level classes, specialty types of courses. And as we've seen with other marginalized groups historically, some of the first instances of visibility have been sort of this exotification or othering of said group, turning what little representation there is into this sort of spectacle for the outside community to sort of gawk at or to tokenize, which is sort of the appearance of inclusion, but oftentimes we lean on those stereotypes and tolerance as opposed to authenticity and full acceptance, right? And so we're here to sort of show that we are not necessarily this little niche group. We are, we're here and we're ever present in all aspects of our society. And so in our classrooms, we really aim to move beyond this sort of stereotypical othering kind of visibility into more authentic and empowering types of representations that not only serve, but really affirm the identities of our LGBTQ+ students. And in fact, in 2017, the HRC reported that only 5% of students felt that all of their teachers and school staff are supportive of LGBTQ+ people. And only 13% of LGBTQ+ youth reported hearing positive messaging about being LGBTQ+ at school. So 5% and 13%, which are both extremely low numbers and let us know that this is why we're here, right? This is the kind of work that we need to do. Oops. Okay, so I want to start by talking a little bit about the impact that coming out can have for our students. And I want to first acknowledge that coming out is very much a personal choice. It's a choice that those of us in the community have to make daily, right? Some of us multiple times a day. And we have to really weigh the safety of that decision, right? In what spaces we choose to come out in and what spaces we choose not to come out in, depending on a variety of factors. And so I just want to acknowledge that before I kind of jump into this piece. And when I talk about coming out, I don't necessarily mean just coming out as someone who's part of the community, but coming out as an ally, coming out as an advocate, co-conspirator, right? All of these are different methods of coming out. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my story and why I have chosen to come out to my classrooms before the semester actually even begins. So I did my master's degree at the University of Idaho in Northern Idaho, which is a very white, rural, conservative area. And when I first began teaching, I was not out to my students at all. In fact, I had very long hair at the time. I was definitely more feminine presenting at the time because I didn't want people to make these assumptions about me, right? I was scared for my physical safety. But when I was teaching a creative nonfiction course, I had a student whose name and whose appearance appeared very feminine. The name on my roster, I should say. And I noticed this student started turning in assignments, writing a different name on the assignments, a more masculine sounding name. And so I kept the student after class one day and just asked them, hey, I noticed you're writing this name. Would you like me to address you in this way? Would you like me to use he, she pronouns for you? And the student just kind of stared at me and just started sobbing. So I was like, are you okay? Like, I'm sorry if I upset you. But really they were crying because no one had ever asked them that before. And in fact, this student is still a friend of mine on social media. But I saw the kind of impact that had, right? Just affirming the student's identity in my classroom. And they asked me to actually tell the rest of the class to also address them in this way, the way that they preferred. And the student was relatively successful in the class moving forward. And so I really started thinking about, okay, what are the roles that my own identities can have in having this kind of impact on students and creating this LGBTQ plus affirming space. And so what I started doing was I started coming out to my classes on day one when I'm introducing myself. But more recently, with this whole pandemic going on and virtual learning, I started sending a welcome video to my students like a week or two before the semester with my syllabus attached and some information. And in that welcome video, I very clearly say right off the bat, I'm a queer identified woman. I'm the daughter of 2 Mexican immigrants. I kind of put those aspects of my identity out in the open to kind of increase that visibility and to let these students see that they do have role models within our community. There are professionals within our community that are out and proud, and that's something that they can sort of strive for as well, right? And I would actually argue that about a third of my students this semester have come out to me, about a third, which is a huge number compared to the 1 or 2 students that had been coming out to me in previous years. And I have to think that the fact that I came out to my students so openly right at the beginning of the semester played some kind of role in that. And in fact, in the Trevor Project in 2020, they conducted a survey, and they support the idea that the LGBTQ plus students feel safe and are less likely to try committing suicide if they have access to at least one in-person LGBTQ plus affirming space. Just one space makes our students feel better, increases their mental health, and reduces their risk of attempting or committing suicide, which we know we have very disproportionate rates of that, unfortunately. And so our classrooms can really be this kind of space for our students. And you can see up here, this is a little image from my syllabus. I have my face over Yoda, and I have little word bubbles saying ally, saying Black Lives Matter, right? So if you don't feel comfortable really kind of making this proclamation to your students of being part of the community or an ally or an advocate, there are smaller ways that you can kind of bring that forward. That you're an ally on your syllabus. Students do see that and they do notice it, and that does have an impact for them. The other thing we can think about when bringing queer visibility to our classroom, I'm an English instructor, so there's a lot of different ways for me to do this, but I think often about the types of texts I'm bringing into my classroom. How can I include queer writers, but not necessarily just white queer writers, which we have seen historically being done in English classrooms, right? How can we be intentional about being intersectional with the queer writers that we bring into our classes? And also, how can we make sure that their queerness is not the only aspect of them that we talk about, right? We don't want to lean into that tokenization or, stereotyping members of our community. We want the representation to feel really authentic and genuine. And so one text that I bring into my English 1B class is A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. And we spend a lot of time talking about who she is and the cultural context of her identities, right? So she's a queer woman, she was a socialist, she was Black, she was raised middle class, right? So we look at all aspects of who she is and we think about how did her experiences in her life shape the way that she approached writing this play that doesn't necessarily have any queer characters in it, right? And we can talk about that. Why would she have made that choice given the historical context of when this play was written? How might her other identities impact those choices, right? So it really allows us to kind of jump in and approach the text from a lot of different angles, right? Not just the queer angle. I also teach a story called The Husband Stitch by Carmen Maria Machado. She's right here. That's a story that has a lot of, talks about sexuality really kind of openly in a way that a lot of literature, especially written from the point of view of women, has not been. And the narrator in the story is a woman who is married to a man, but she still has sexual feelings for women. It's sort of a reimagining of the Green Ribbon story. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that. It's kind of like a horror story. Her head falls off and the ribbon is removed at the end of the story. Spoiler alert. But in the story, we're really able to talk about like female sexuality, the complexities of sexuality. There's an interview with Carmen Maria Machado that we read about why she talks so openly about sex in this text. Like what is the literary purpose of doing so? And so we're able to kind of talk about different aspects of sexuality and gender. Given the author's experiences and identities as well. And so I have up here just a variety of different queer identified authors that I bring into both my English 1A and my English 1B classes. Another way we can bring queer visibility to the classroom is using intentionally inclusive language. You've probably heard some of this before. So not assuming someone's pronouns, asking for their pronouns instead, right? Instead of saying husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, using the word partner or significant other, right? Instead of hey guys or hey ladies and gentlemen, team, hey folks, hi all, hi everyone, right? There's a lot of different variations that we can use to be more inclusive. And we can really use this opportunity as a teaching moment to our students as well, right? So for example, in my English 1A class, this last semester, we read a text by a non-binary writer. And so my students got to practice using they, them pronouns for this person who identifies in this way. And it was really difficult for them at the beginning, figuring out where exactly to use they, them, and how to use it there. But I think that practice and us being able to talk about pronouns and talk about why it's important to respect the way people want to be addressed was really not only a moment of like queer visibility in the classroom, but also a moment of let's use this to actually learn how you can do this thing that I'm telling you to do, right? Let's practice doing it. And so I'm gonna pass the mic over to my colleague, Andrea, who's gonna tell us about how she brings in queer visibility in her life science department.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about a place where we're severely lacking in the LGBTQ plus community, and that's in the science classroom. Science has been used against our community for quite a long time. So how do we combat that, and how do we add this into our classroom, providing facts for our student where they feel safe? So let me start by asking you all a question. How many of you have seen your actual chromosomes? In the chat, have you seen your chromosomes? Do you know what chromosomes you possess? And I'm going to guess that most of you have not. So then how do we assign a sex based on XY, XX? How do we assign a gender to someone that we've never ever seen their karyotype? Do we even know what a karyotype is? These are things that we can bring in our classroom. So when a baby is born, the doctor looks at the genitalia and says, great, you're a boy. Great, you're a girl. But is that fair? And what happens when an intersex person is born? The doctor recommends surgery for whatever genitalia is most present. And that's not exactly fair. The child doesn't get to choose. The doctor says, well, they're presenting as female, so let's make them female. And this is not accurate. So we need to take back science for our community. So Let's take a look at some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So our brains and looking at how we actually function. Interestingly enough, sex determination has to do with hormones that we possess through the endocrine system, DNA, gene expression, psychology, neuroscience. All of these combined make someone feel a certain way. And what's very, very interesting is preliminary data showing the brain of transgender folks matches their identified gender. So they were taught to be in a body that they don't feel comfortable in. We need to change this narrative. Also, brains of gay and lesbian folks, they have been shown that their hormone levels match the person that they are identifying with. So saying there's a male and female brain just really isn't accurate. Saying that there's two genders just really isn't accurate. And we're going to talk about that and how you can incorporate these things in your classrooms. So go ahead one. Thank you. So what is in a chromosome and how do we explain this in our classroom? Well, we see anywhere between 1 in 400 to 1 in 1,000 sex chromosome disorders. And I really will use disorder in air quotes because it is not a disorder. What happens is, even though you may be presented with XX chromosomes, you can still have male gonads. XY chromosomes, you can still have ovaries. So saying that genitalia defines your sex is completely not correct. Now, we have located a gene on the Y chromosome. Now, the Y chromosome is this little chromosome on the side over there. And this gene is called the SRY gene. If this gene stops functioning, changes function, has a mutation, or just stops producing, a person can completely exhibit characteristics of the opposing sex. So really not focusing on XX and XY is where we should be in science. So let's see how we can do that. So something that I discuss in biology is something called Klinefelter syndrome. And folks with Klinefelter syndrome are XXY. And what's very interesting is many of these cases do not understand that they have this syndrome until they're older or until there's a problem later in life. Because we don't look at chromosomes, because we don't look at karyotypes. By the way, this is what a karyotype looks like. Many of us have not seen this. So it's not fair for us to assign someone sex based on what genitalia they have. And they're noticing that Klinefelter syndrome, as well as Sawyer syndrome, which I will talk about next, these folks have low testosterone, low muscle mass, facial hair, body hair, but they can have enlarged breasts. So why do we assign them one or the other? And then looking at Sawyer syndrome, this one is a mutation in that SRY gene. So while the rest of the Y chromosome is intact, in different gonads, they do not get signals to become testes, okay? And most of these folks are infertile. So again, it's not fair to classify someone in this way. And the reason why I'm saying it as a syndrome is because this is how it has been presented in text. I promise you this is not how it is in the classroom, and I'm going to talk about that as we go down. So yes, absolutely not a disorder. Look at this crazy slide. This is just one cell signaling pathway that has to be, is in development of gonads, okay? It is crazy for us to think that not one of these things can be upregulated, downregulated, shut off, turned on. So this entire thing is only one facet of a human. So to say something as narrow-minded as there's an X and Y and an XX, and that makes you male and female. So let's also look at hormones. Hormones have everything to do with our lives, right? We talk about hormones for everything. All of us possess estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, male or female, we all present these. What's interesting is early childhood studies determine that which hormone is converted to estrogen in the brain early in development may correspond with your identified gender. Transgender folks are real, and they have absolutely scientific basis for being here. I am so sick and tired of folks saying and sitting in front of colleges saying there are only this gender and this gender. There's so many variations in between. We also see that testosterone levels change and estrogen levels change with early childhood trauma. Things can be upregulated and downregulated. So understanding that certain places in our life, we may exhibit more testosterone. We may exhibit less estrogen. That doesn't change who we are. And being of reproductive age and being able to reproduce does not a woman make. Many of us have had our reproductive organs removed. Does that mean that we're any less of the gender that we identify with? No, it does not. So understanding that female embryos expressed to high levels of androgens can develop the organs of being a female, but still present as male. Yeah, there we go. And looking at evolution. One of the things we teach in biology is evolution. Where we go with evolution, you know, we talk about how we have evolved. Well, some of us have evolved, right? But talking about how we evolved, it's more than likely that the Y chromosome is an evolutionary shutting down of a Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome was, the early studies have shown that these were a lot of things that were ignored by researchers. The Y chromosome is much smaller than the X chromosome. It continues to exhibit high signs of this Y degeneration as we progress. We also have folks that present with only X chromosome, one X chromosome, yet they continue to exhibit signs of maleism. Okay, so please understand that when we talk about X and Y, it doesn't mean gender. It doesn't mean sex. These are things that we have been taught over the years and we've been taught incorrectly. And I start teaching my students very early about something called pseudoscience. And I think it's very important that we have these conversations with our students on what is science, because science is fact, it's not fiction. And science doesn't change based on your policy. Another thing, I like to talk about a word that hurts that we talk about in biology all the time, and that is hermaphrodite. A hermaphrodite is not a person. A hermaphrodite is a plant. A true hermaphrodite is a plant. We use intersex for folks that present with both genitalia. We do not use hermaphrodite. Please do not use hermaphrodite when you are talking to your students, and please make the distinction in your class. So I'll show you some ways that that I like to incorporate these in my classroom. So in biology, of course we do the chromosomes, we do evolution, polygenic sex determination, and really try to use correct terminology. Look, folks, I make mistakes all the time. I love to come into classroom and say, "Good morning, guys," and then I stop myself. It's not fair. So we are all evolving and we are all trying to do better. In health sciences, social connections, mental health and resources, endocrine and hormone system, gender-based health, advocacy, and we do have debates. And I love to do this because we can stimulate students' minds to grasping this concept of that we've been lied to all of these years scientifically. Now, one of the things I'd like to do on campus is I'm a part of LASSE, the LGBT plus Association for Student Success and Equity. I encourage my students to go to those meetings. And what I do is I offer them credit for going. So, you know, a student will jump for 5 extra credit points. Give them 5 extra credit points to go, because even if they don't agree with what you're saying, they're going to listen and they're going to have to write about it. And I promise you it will make them think twice about these things. So how do we invite these conversations? Talk to them. Like Wendy said, come out to them if you feel comfortable. Use pronouns. In my syllabus, right away, I talk about pronouns and your preferred name. This is who students are. Do not shut them down. So make sure those silent voices are heard in your classroom. Make sure you're listening and make sure you're trying your best to be an ally. And allyship means action, not words. Thank you.
Thank you, Drea. Muy buenos días a todos. I'm very thrilled to be here and to pick up where you've just left off with this idea of visibility. And what I love about this discussion is that I think Rob, Wendy, and Drea and I have each built upon the strategies of each other and are bringing these ideas to the classroom. So for me, the art history classroom, like many courses in the humanities, these are spaces for understanding the world's creative output. That's what drew me to the field. And our program learning outcomes center on this idea of articulating art terminology for critical discussion about the cultural and historical contexts that produced works of art in various media. So we focus on developing observational skills for comparing and contrasting different works and developing those ideas further as the courses progress, such as the 2 paintings that we see on screen. As a discipline, then, art history still upholds many of the heterosexist ideas of the past, from instruction at the high school level all the way through universities and in museum and galleries. And you see on screen here a sort of snapshot of what our art history classrooms look like. Queer inclusion in these spaces then can open up to a number of potential intersectional discussions about people of the past and the present. And so one starting point for this discussion is to look at the ways that contemporary artists have engaged with the past. And that's something that I see happening across other disciplines in the humanities. And yet too often, the courses that are structured on Western European or North American, specifically United States art or literature, history, music, theater, dance, are outweighted to the arts of the rest of the world. We talk about the West and the rest, and that's still a problem in the discipline of art history. And yet I attempt in each of the courses that I teach to bring in queer artists, discussions about gender, gender identity, gender expression, often through comparison of different cultures, communities, religions, and other traditions at the same time and across time, so that we can nuance some of the discussions that Drea just mentioned for us. The use of the term hermaphrodite in ancient Greek and Roman culture, and the distinction between that deity and ideas about gender and sexuality today and in other parts of the world, or even discussions about Klinefelter or Sawyer syndrome that have started to be introduced in art history textbooks. So from my perspective, I don't see a distinction between discussions of art history and discussions of sexuality, gender, and so forth. There's overlap in all of these areas. Yet there's a push in higher education campuses to now break up these Western and so-called non-Western courses. And so with the next slide, I introduce another important art historical phenomenon, which is the meme. And so we say, eliminate the white Western-centric survey course. Groundbreaking. You know, this is something that as humanistic disciplines we've known about for decades. I'd say 60 years, if not more, about the need to continue to expand our disciplines to be more inclusive, not just with first, second, third, fourth wave feminism and post-colonial research, queer theory, and more. Our students in the classroom have asked for more. And so one of the assignments that I give to my classes early on is to look at the tables of contents of art history books over the years to see how a textbook from 1920 looks compared to a textbook just authored and released this year. In the next slide, then, I encourage students to find art history all around them, from architecture in our community, but also engaging in pop culture, binge-worthy series, fashion runways, and more. Just last night, I noticed an important painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection in the Netflix series Shadow and Bone. And a few of my students wrote this morning, like, no fucking way, sorry for the expletive. You know, like, this is the incredible power of being able to see art history all around us. But for the next slide, I then ask, where is LGBTQIA2+ history? Something I've learned from Wendy is after establishing community norms in the first weeks of class, I ask my students to look over the syllabus, to look over museum and art historical resources online, and ask, where do I see myself in these stories? And often students will write about their religious traditions, their heritage, their cultural or ethnic backgrounds, maybe their gender identity, expression, and sexuality. It allows students to express who they are in ways that they feel safe and comfortable. And I model that by showing where I see myself reflected in art history. As a queer, non-conforming individual, I often only see myself, or a queer community, presented in relation to ancient Greek and Roman sexual relationships between older men and young boys, or jumping forward to the Renaissance or the Baroque when we read salacious biographies about Michelangelo or Caravaggio, or leaping forward even further to the outbreak of AIDS. And what does that mean for our community when we only see ourselves in these perforated moments? At a Hispanic serving college like Riverside City College, I also attempt to bring in Chicanx, Latinx art in each of the modules that I teach as well, and queer artists all the more, or artists that address queer communities like Graciela Iturbide in the lower right. So with the next slide, one of the experiences that really was formative for me was visiting the Swedish National Museum, in which this quote was on the wall. If you don't know you have a past, it can be hard to imagine you have a future. And I bring that with me in every course and have drafted the next slide as a statement of full-throated support for queer inclusion, that any history that does not acknowledge the intersectional identities and queer experiences of people in the past is anachronistic. Although the words that we use to describe ourselves today are forms of self-advocacy and resistance against oppressive heterosexism, they also help us to understand the complexities of sexuality and gender from our origins on the planet to the present, and that they'll continue to expand. Our history has too long been censored and marginalized by institutions of higher learning, but our stories, like us, are all around us, and they always will be. So telling these stories saves lives, because knowing our full past gives us hope for the future. And with that, Rob, I pass the baton off to you. Gracias a todos.
All right, thank you, Brian. So basically, I teach English 1A, and the big thing there is critical thinking, reading, writing, critical thinking. So I use what I call liberation andragogy, andragogy being teaching adults. And there's two thinkers that I want to talk about that I'm basing this on. So one is Antonio Gramsci, who was a communist in the beginning of the 20th century, and basically talked about what he called organic intellectuals, who there were two different, there was the intellectual class, which a lot of us are a part of, and then organic intellectuals who were actually people sort of like embedded in the working classes. And the idea that the people embedded in the working classes would essentially educate other people in the working classes to then create mass movements, right, for the liberation of the worker. Fast forward to Angela Davis. Basically, Angela Davis, after the public accusation of George Floyd, said, this is the period we need to begin the process of popular education that will allow people to understand the interconnections of racism, heterosexism, and heteropatriarchy, rather, and capitalism. Right, and so this is an idea that I think about in that if we're thinking about intersectionality, thinking about interconnection. So not just the ways that we're actually separate, but actually the places that we can also then link up in that sort of separateness, if that makes sense, depending on the space that we're talking about. Are we talking about school? Are we talking about family? Are we talking about work? And then if we're thinking about queer visibility, right? My class then, a lot of us have themes, thematically runs along class. And so we look at different intersections depending on the space that we're looking at. And so then queer intersections come up basically when they come up. So there's no sort of, tokenization there. One of the articles that I use is Capitalism and Gay Identity, which is old, it's from 1979. And essentially, basically what it talks about is that as we move into industrial capitalism, people need to leave the farms, go to the cities, and that's essentially how, especially gay men and lesbians is what he focuses on, how they find each other, how they find community. He also talks about that essentially, if we look at the last 3 bullets here, so processes which the family once performed are now commodified, right? So basically the stuff that the family used to do, grow your own food, make your own clothes, right? You have to go buy those things now, right? And so as wage increases fail to keep up with the cost of living increases, workers' lives become more insecure and anxiety increases. And by the 1970s, the increased visibility of lesbian and gay men are used as a scapegoat for this insecurity in order to ease anxiety and manage the working classes. So there's a bait and switch that goes on there, where essentially, so as a straight worker, I'm super anxious because I can't pay my bills anymore. Well, the reason that you're anxious is because of these gay men and lesbians, right? They want rights. That's the problem, all right? So there's a bait and switch that goes on, all right? Next slide. So this is one of the discussion posts from one of my queer students. And essentially, I'm going to read a little bit of it and just kind of talk about it. So the one passage that stood out to me was the elevation of the family to ideological preeminence guarantees that capitalist society will reproduce not just children, but heterosexism and homophobia. In the most profound sense, capitalism is the problem, right? So this is a very heavy idea. And essentially the student starts working through it, starting with religion, because that's what the student is most familiar with. Because of course, if we're talking about our queer students, they've been thinking about being queer their entire lives. They might not have the language to understand it, but they've been thinking about it and working through that. And that's where sort of the critical thinking for the course comes from, and where we then have this idea of organic intellectual. So you know, one of the things that I'm hoping, right, is that at some point this queer student through all of their schooling, right, will then become an organic intellectual that will sort of help create these mass movements, all right? Next slide. So, so this is sort of like just a little thumbnail of history here. So the last slide was, you know, sort of fostering the organic intellectual. Remember that we also have organic intellectuals coming into our classes, right? And that we as queer people and trans people have a history of organic intellectuals, right? And so if we look at like the 1970s, we have the Gay Liberation Front, which was came out of Stonewall, was started by queer socialists. Also, one little thing that I put up here, so because I'm sort of like a queer history, not a little bit amateur, is a statement to the psychiatric profession by Gay Liberation. So this was in the early 70s, where essentially, you know, again, if we're thinking about how the organic intellectual works, right? So the gay working classes sort of educated each other on what it actually means to be gay, right? And then got together and demanded from psychology that they be taken off of out of the DSM, right? This is how change happens, right? Also, the struggles that happen within sort of circles, right? So the struggle never ends, right? And so the one below that in the 1970s is the Lavender Menace. So that was, you know, Betty Friedan in 1971-ish, basically, you know, didn't want lesbians in the feminist women's movement because she thought it would give them a bad name. And lesbians actually, and she called them the Lavender Menace. Lesbians took that and made it their own and actually used it to convince straight feminists that that you know that they should be aligned. If we look at the 1980s, right? Of course, AIDS was, and you know, I'm actually not going to use the word AIDS. I'm going to use the acronym that was used before AIDS, which was GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, right? This is very important for, and although there are exceptions, right? Not all straight people, right? For the most part, the heterosexist structure was not interested in grid until it became AIDS, and really until we sort of had the sort of almost like the immaculate transfer with Ryan White, where sex was not involved, right? And so we had to take care of ourselves, right? And we did that, right? And then if you look at today, right, we have this really wonderful, these are our students, right, who understand this, right, who understand these kinds of interconnections. And if we see like, so, you know, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us, and then, you know, we can't breathe, like, you know, we're talking about multiple identities, finding interconnections to then create mass movements to actually overthrow the systems of oppression. And this can actually start in our classrooms, right? And be fostered in our classrooms. All right, so I think I'm done there. That gives us 3 minutes left, I think. So I'm cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and if we have 3 minutes, we can open it up for questions. And if we don't get to them, you can feel free to email us. We can put our emails in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer questions beyond the 3 minutes. So is there anything anybody wanted to ask about, chat about?
Hi, sorry. Hi, good morning. Yes, it's still morning. I just wanted to say and encourage, I know that you all are putting these videos out there for us. If there's any possible way to possibly split them up, because I know that I can see these being useful in many different parts of our campus's resource page. And as educators, we steal from each other, right? So I would love to steal if that's at all possible, and if with your permission, of course.
Yeah, I think we would all be okay with that, right, team?
Yeah, absolutely.
Use.
I'm sure a lot of us have extra slides. Remember, we had to like cut these down. We could all talk about our disciplines all day long, I feel. So yeah, we will do as much as we can.
Right, and we also do have sort of like more resources. There's a page that we created that I have to figure out how to get into the app, but when, you know, I'll do that today.
Any other questions?
Can Andrea put her email address in the chat again?
I think, yeah, let me do it. I'll do it, right? That's okay.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I really appreciate the conversation and the presentation that you all made. It's an education, and I just wanted to say thank you and good work.
Thank you, Kendrick. Appreciate it.
And also remember, we can share as well. We have a lot of stuff that we put in our syllabus. So syllabi is a really, really important tool to get to your students. So making sure there was inclusion in your syllabus is really important.
Yeah, we have a few questions. I see a hand up and I see a question in the chat. Jamie wants to know if myself or any of you, if you come out to your students, are we concerned about anyone from the college taking action against us as a result of us coming out? And how would we deal with that? I actually have not had too much concerns about that, Jamie, mostly because I feel like from an LGBTQ plus perspective, my college is particularly inclusive and accepting. Our college president, for example, has attended our meetings. He attends a lot of the events, as do several of our administrators. And so at the institutional level, I feel very supported. I haven't had any issues with colleagues either. I've had a few students say some kind of offhanded things, not at RCC, but at other institutions. I had a student when I taught actually that a creative writing class told me that I was shoving bisexual poetry down students' throats. And I quickly looked back through my curriculum, and out of the 60 poems they read that semester, 5 had non-heterosexual romance involved. So I wasn't too concerned about that comment once I kind of looked back and reflected. And we also actually recently published an out and proud list through our college. So it's a list of anyone who identifies within the community who wants to be open and out as a resource for students, and then anyone who identifies as an ally. And we're in a virtual space now, but we're going to get those printed up as posters and kind of put them all around the campus to, again, increase visibility, see that students have role models, students have people they can reach out to if they have any particular issues. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
Hi, everyone. It's Patty. I'm your tech coordinator, and I want to thank you all for participating in this breakout session. It was very informative. I'd like to thank all the presenters, and I want to remind everybody to take the survey that's in the app. It will help us with planning purposes, and you can also earn points for every survey that you do, and the top participants will win a prize. So thank you so much, presenters and participants, for joining this, and have a great day. And thanks again for joining the LGBTQ+ Summit for the community colleges. Thank you.